Hi, thanks for joining us. You are at an Gamecity Impulse event. Our topic today is designing better gender options. But before we get to that, what even is Gamecity? Or before we get to that, let me refrain. We'll take a quick look at our schedule. So you are currently in the welcome and introduction part. Then Arden is going to introduce themselves and we'll start the talk. The talk is going to be about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for a Q&A round, and at 6:30 at the latest, we're going to finish this event. So back to the introduction part. What is Gamecity Hamburg? Now that I've teased it so much, we are a location initiative funded by the city of Hamburg in Germany. Not sure if everyone is familiar with us. We have three main parts of our different programs. First up, there is funding. We fund two different programs. First up, there's prototype funding and the GamesLift incubator. But in addition to that, we also aim to bring teams and devs from Hamburg to different international events. For example, to Gamescom in August. If you're there, please stop by the Indie Arena booth where we and 5 teams from Hamburg will be at and just say hi. Or how about taking a trip to Hamburg in October to the Polaris convention? There will also be a couple of Hamburg dev teams who you can meet there. In addition to that, we do a lot of programs which promote knowledge exchange. There's the Game Starter, our Indie Dev Insight series, but also, of course, the Impulse series, which you're sitting in right now. In addition to that, we also have a couple of networking opportunities at Gamecity Hamburg. For example, our big Gamecity Treff. This is a live event in Hamburg with about 200 people from the games industry each time around. But also there's the Indie Treff here in Hamburg from the indie community themselves. And there's also a Flinter Games meetup, which coincidentally is happening next week. So if you're located in or near Hamburg, or you really, really want to take a trip, please come join us. It's the first anniversary of our Flinter Games meetup. Location TBA, depending on the weather. But also a very special edition because for the first time for this anniversary, we are inviting allies to join us as well. So even if you're not part of the Flinter community, as long as you support the cause and support the Flinter people around you, we'd be very happy to have you. So that's it from my side. I'm going to pass the baton over to Arden now, who will tell us all about how to design better gender options for your games.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for coming.
Okay, so you should be able to see my screen now.
Yes.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, without any further ado, let me take you into my talk where I'll also be introducing myself, so don't worry. So today we'll be talking about designing better gender options. So here is, so sorry, I need to somehow get rid of the little, okay, there we go. So here's my overview. So first I'm going to be talking about myself. Then I'm going to introduce you to what I call the choice. And then we're going to lay some groundwork and talk about gender signifiers. And then we're going to spend the majority of the talk, around about maybe half an hour, 20 minutes, talking about a new design framework that you can use for your own projects. And after that, I want to leave you with some useful resources to do some further research. And then we're going to open up to the Q&A. So about myself. So I'm Arden Osthof, and I'm a non-binary freelance narrative designer. I've worked on Anno 2205 and 1800, and also on Tom Clancy's The Division 2. And I'm currently working on indie projects, namely Mars Vice and Morbid Metal. And why I'm giving this talk here today is I've become interested in character creators, and I've been researching them since 2017-ish. But I've always been interested in them because, as you already know, I'm non-binary and I'm always looking for, okay, well, how much freedom can you actually give me here? So with that in mind, let me introduce you to what I have come to call the choice. You will see this in especially a lot of more older games. You're going to get asked, are you a boy or are you a girl? And then depending on this type of choice, there is a whole lot of things that happen. You get an appearance assigned to you. This changes how people talk to you and about you. It might change which customization options are available to you, like, for example, haircuts. And in some games, it also changes the story a little bit. For example, in Dragon Age Inquisition, your gender influences who you can romance. So why is this a problem? It's because all of these things that I have just mentioned, they are not player choices. They're all choices that have been taken away from players. And as you might have guessed, this is particularly limiting to your non-binary and trans players. But in fact, this also limits your cisgender players as well, because at the end of the day, everyone benefits from having more player freedom. You might know guys who wear long hair, for example. And something also to keep in mind is that as there are more and more games with better customization options, that there's also increased scrutiny and expectations from your players and also from the press. So let's lay some groundwork so we're all on the same page and really well equipped to start into the framework that is hopefully going to get you there. And let's talk about gender signifiers. So, oops, I forgot to take that slide out, but let's take it back to what I was just saying about all of these unchoices, because they're really not actual choices that you've made. And let's examine how our society traditionally treats gender and how we can break that down to our benefit. So let's imagine two buckets. There's a pink one and a blue one, and they don't have any overlap. And then we start filling them with different things that we think are gender. So there's something like clothes. In one bucket, you'll have dresses, and another bucket, you're going to have suits. There is language. You are going to put the she, her pronouns into this bucket and the he, him pronouns into the other bucket, but also things like calling someone a woman or a man or sir or madam, and they all go into their specific buckets. And then, of course, there is a certain expectation of what people's bodies look like and what features those bodies have. And this bucket presents, this is where you can choose your things from, and this is what makes up your pool of what is available to you. Now, of course, a lot of games have already gone way beyond that, and they allow you to pick things from another bucket, and you can mix and match a little bit. There's maybe also some overlap where you have certain things that are not only in one bucket. There's games that allow you to choose whichever pronoun you like. But the best way to really think about this is not to think about, okay, what is gender and then what makes up this gender, but to take away these buckets altogether and sort these according to what they actually are, which is different gender signifiers. So you have your body and the features of bodies, you have pronouns, and you have clothes and accessory. Like none of these things are inherently a gender. And something that you'll also have noticed is that I have picked very binary examples, but of course, there is way more than just suits and dresses. You have all sorts of clothes. And in the same vein, you have more than two pronouns that are established in our society. And coming to the thorniest aspects of them all is there's also not one way for a woman to look and one way for a man to look, or not even one way that a woman has to have a body. In reality, humans are incredibly diverse and so are their bodies. And I encourage you to also think about the different features of a body and what you expect them to be and how you expect them to be grouped together. For example, just because you have a flat chest doesn't mean you have to have a penis. So you've got different sexual characteristics that don't necessarily need to go into the same set, just as we don't actually have these buckets that dictate that just because you use she, her pronouns, you have to always be wearing a dress. So with all of this theory in mind and thinking about these things as individual pieces from each other that all can signify gender that you can use to play around with it, but aren't in themselves gender or even linked to each other. How do we build customization out of this? So I think a lot of people will immediately think about something like this, a very detailed character creator. For example, Saints Row 5 has all the sliders you might want to customize your body, and Calico has so many lovely options and also many sliders. But also this means quite a lot of scope. Maybe this isn't right for your game. An entirely different approach might be something like a pronoun selection. You don't see the protagonist at all. The protagonist is just spoken about and to sometimes, so you'll want to know how to talk about them. And then some games do away with gender entirely and decide to make their protagonist as ambiguous as possible to maximize the projection space for players. So, for example, in Alone with You, the character on the right is actually the player character, and they are in the spacesuit that obscures any kind of gender signifier very intentionally to allow any type of player to see themselves as this character. So this begs the question, which one is the best one? And obviously this is kind of a rhetorical question, or I wouldn't be introducing to a framework, because there isn't the one perfect way that you can copy and then you're good to go. Because there's really only the right way to go for your game. So gender is really complex, so the solution needs to be just as tailored to that. Which brings us to a new framework that I want to introduce to you, which consists of 5 questions to ask yourself during the development of your game to really, from the ground up, think about what's the best way to offer choices to players. And as the very first question you should ask yourself, it's what role does the player gender actually have in your game? Let me show you some examples to show what I mean by this. So in The Sims 4, gender is really important because the Sims simulate our world, and that includes gender. It impacts everyday life in a lot of ways, and people are here to play Sims to simulate everyday life and have fun little scenarios. And gender would naturally then impact things like sex and dating, your Sims' appearance, character dynamics, the fashion that they wear, and more. And here's an example for the complete opposite of that. So in Anno 2205, gender is completely irrelevant. So you don't have an avatar in the world because you always see everything from this godlike top-down view. It has absolutely no bearing on the gameplay because you're building little cities and little economies. And in this game, there's actually no reference to gender at all, at least not to the player's gender, because all of the characters are talking to them. And that kind of begs the question, is gender even necessary if it actually has no bearing on this and might actually even detract from the gameplay because players are just going to play as themselves and they're going to look at their city directly? Then gender is completely irrelevant. Maybe you don't need it at all. And I suspect a lot of games that have some level of customization are going to fall somewhere in between these two poles, where it is important in some ways, but not others. For example, in Dragon Age Inquisition, you use your avatar because it enables roleplay better. And your gender has an impact on the game. For example, in the romance, it is quite important that when you have a romance with Dorian, who is a gay man, that you are actually also a man because that ties directly into the story. But in other ways, it is intentionally irrelevant. It makes no difference what gender you play as when you're in combat. And then there are some games that are a little bit to the side and you think don't actually really fall on this question at all, but actually reveal some really interesting things as well. For example, in Dream Daddy, what if the protagonist is a man by default? This isn't the usual, oh, women are too hard to animate, that's why we only have men, but this is part of the premise of the game. which is that you are a single dad and you move into this town because you want to meet other single dads. And what the devs very smartly considered is that there are many types of men, and that includes trans men. So in the screenshot in the middle that you see here, the lower row are binders that are used to flatten the chest. And to players in the know, they will immediately clock these as binders also because it says there, and they will understand that if they select this, they are playing as a trans mask character. So you can see that even games that have a set gender benefit from asking this question sometimes. And what's really cool about this example is that it ties into the theme of masculinity and queerness. And therefore, you can also consider if maybe there is a story or world building reason in your game that allows for a kind of left field take of gender. Maybe you have a sci-fi or fantasy setting that has a different gender system, or aliens with a different biology that you should really think about a little bit more closely. So, in order for you to answer this question a little bit better for your own game, I want to give you a few pointers. Ask yourself, does the gender play a role in your theme, maybe through identity or queerness? Do you want it to impact your gameplay at all? Like through romance, but it can also be something like a conversation option. Is there maybe a different gender system or species biology in your game world? How can gender add more depth to your game? And conversely, do you think adding it would actually detract something from it? Because keep in mind that gender can really enhance the player fantasy, and it can also distract from it. So this talk is being recorded, but if you would like to take a screenshot of this, now is the time to do it. All right, that should be enough time. Let's move on. The next question out of the 5 questions to ask yourself is, how do we refer to the player? So the most obvious thing that might come to mind is pronouns. I've already mentioned this before. Offering a choice of pronouns is a great way of going about this. Definitely would recommend offering more than 2. Some games even opt for a custom pronoun input. This is quite rare because it impacts localization in a very impossible way, which I will talk about briefly in a moment. But read-only memories does this, and it has its own delight for players as well. This is especially useful for any games that are very text-heavy. If you talk to and about the player all the time and you never see them, then a pronoun option is a really wonderful way to go about this. But a pronoun is also not the only text that you can consider that ends up in your game. For example, you can think about titles and names. Pronouns sometimes don't really make a lot of sense if you don't talk about your character very much. And instead, you have a direct address that can also hold a ton of choices and can help you enhance the tone and the world building. As a really good example of both of these things, there is sunless seas. So in sunless seas, in the beginning of the game, you can choose how people talk to you. One is madam, one is sir, one is citizen, there's my lord, my lady, and I think there's a few more than that. And they all add some kind of flavor. For example, citizen has a description of a term of address popular among those of egalitarian sentiments. So it doesn't really hold any information about the gender, but it does also hold information about your political affiliation and beliefs, which is a very neat way to combine these things. And it allows you to combine the gender with a deeper role play because gender doesn't always exist in isolation, or actually never does exist in isolation. Keep in mind here that in English, the direct form of address, often like you, doesn't have a gender pronoun, but it might in other languages. We'll get back to that in 1 second, I swear. So here's an example of avoiding gender entirely, which actually I encourage you to make a conscious effort because gender might slip in a little faster and more insidiously than you can think. So if you address your player always directly as you and entirely avoid gendered language like ma'am or my guy or yes, sir, you're basically good to go. And on the development of Anno 2205, there actually were a few instances where when we did the editing pass of the game, we realized that we had accidentally gendered the player by saying, yes, sir, or a character going like, oh, there he is, and then the pretend walk over to you. And we were like, oh, no, we just kind of assumed this, but we don't know it all. And we are creating much less work for everyone if we take this out immediately. Because if your gender is irrelevant, as you found out in question 1, then why start introducing gendered language to begin with if you can get away with avoiding it? So let's talk about that localization interlude I promised. So this is a whole topic that is an entire talk unto itself. So I thought it is a lot more useful if I leave you with a few useful pointers and strategies to go around this. So the first one is obvious, which is plan early. Which languages are you translating into? Are there any tech considerations for this? Like, for example, one language has only one pronoun and therefore doesn't need a pronoun selection, but another language does, and therefore you need to have slightly different version for each language. And also, what timeline? When are you bringing in your localization managers and translators? I would recommend having a meeting about this as early as you can, even way before you actually start the translation. Yeah, on that note, get in touch with your translators because they're waiting for this. I know that localizing gender neutral language and non-binary pronouns is a really hot topic right now. And there are a lot of teams that are actively working on this or have already released something. So this is not a new topic to localizers. And keep in mind that you're going to have to talk to localizers about how to do this, even with binary genders, because English has a really easy time where you can very easily avoid gender, and that might not be the case in other languages. So talk to your localization managers and they will be able to advise you. And when you do, be very specific about your needs. There's a really big difference between genderqueer identity and gender neutrality, if you want to talk about broadly. Anyone could be this, or if you want to be like, hey, that's Jack over there, and they're very cool. And be prepared to do a little bit of research of your own and potentially also work with queer organizations in the target languages that you're translating into. And then also be aware that the answer might sometimes be like, oh, we don't really do this via pronoun because we don't have an established neutral pronoun, but you might want to do something like this, etc. So I really hope that this will be helpful. It is, like I said, kind of a topic unto its own, but it can be done. And with that, let's give you a few questions to help you along this journey when it comes to how to refer to the player. So the first one is, who or what talks to or about the player? Is it NPCs? Is it narrator? Is it menu text? Where does this even appear? Do you want to offer choice or do you want to go for a neutral language? Can you use this somehow to enhance your role play? Sorry, that's my cat. She wants to role play, I guess. What type of language fits your game genre? Can you play with the tone a little bit here, like in the Sunless Seas example? And have you consulted a localization manager yet? Because using the right language really is key to not break players' immersions in your game. I'll give you a moment to screenshot this if you'd like. So let's move on to the next question, which is, what is the basis of the player avatar? And sorry, let's go back one. Unlike what I've already complained about a little bit, this idea of two very normed bodies that present this is what a man looks like and this is what a woman looks like. what you might want to prefer is look into using one body as a template, because this can be quicker than making a male and a female template. And what you can then do with this is using blend shapes. So I highly recommend checking out Aubrey Scott's talk, Genderfuck 2077, which is free on the GDC Vault, because she goes into a lot more technical depth of how you can use blend shapes to get the best results. And the game example that I encourage you to check out is Calico. So Calico works by just having one template and sliders that allow you to adjust your chest, your butt, your nose, shoulders, and the waist. And you can end up with very different looking bodies that can present very different gender signifiers. And you can also mix and match them by having these sliders be separate from each other. Another way that you can also use in combination is using a few archetypes. So by starting out with a few different archetypes, this allows for a greater diversity and, for example, especially larger body models. And it also ensures that you have higher quality models than by working purely with blend shapes. And of course, you can then go on and combine these with blend shapes and customize these further. And also, the idea of using archetypes can be used in 2D as well. For example, Picrew is not necessarily a game, but it is a really popular icon maker online where people basically have these little templates. And what's very common to see is that they have a few different body shapes to choose from. And you can also tell that they're not really gendered, because it's really just like up to here. And it was like the really fits the medium and the goal that they were trying to reach you. And then there's also a really fun one that can work when you have the stars and the moons aligned, but also because these developers worked really hard on this, which is, what about having no template at all and letting players mix and match individual features to create a really unique looking avatar? So there's no artificial gendering of saying like, okay, so here are the female faces and here are the male faces. Oops, sorry. But instead, here's a bunch of different noses, and some of them are really big and some of them are really small. Here's a bunch of different hairs and hats and chins and also beards. And it allows you to create really different looking avatars that basically have the same base, because they don't actually have a base as such. So you can see that this is actually the same face as this one. I just chose different accessories. And then, of course, you can also choose slightly different facial features. So to help you in answering this question, here are some more questions. How should players see their characters in the game? Is it a 2D game? Is it a third-person game? All of these questions. What are the genre conventions that you can lean on here? For example, are there visual novel portraits, or do players not see themselves at all because it is a visual novel? Is it a third-person model because it's a third-person shooter? And what are people's expectations of what they can see of their avatar and what their avatar does? And how can you break the binary in order to increase player choice? And what are some ways to be cost effective about this without falling back on these idealized bodies? This goes back to the idea with the blend shapes. Because defaulting to just having these two templates can really alienate a lot of players. And I'm not only talking about non-binary players that don't see themselves as either one of these options, but also it's just very rare that a man looks pretty much like the male model that is available. So I'll give you a moment if you'd like to take a screenshot. All right, let's move on to the fourth question. How can players accurately represent themselves in your game? So this goes into how can we build just a little bit more choice off of what you just talked about. So one way of doing this is graduations and sliders. This allows you to multiply the choice by offering all of these graduations in between. As I've already talked about body types and body parts, but there's also other ways of doing this, like, for example, in the voice pitch. So in Hogwarts Legacy, as much as it pains me to bring up a Harry Potter IP, but what they actually have is, as a big AAA production, they allow you to adjust the voice sliders. They have two different voices, and then they allow you to shift the pitch lower or higher. And in Saints Row, you will find a lot of examples of how to use sliders to affect the avatar body. And I'm wondering, if it's possible with body types and voice pitch, what else can you put on a slider? With a lot of these things, they seem really common now, or at least established, or at least have seen this before. But before developers came up with this, it didn't really exist in anyone's mind. So I really encourage you to think about what is a cool thing you could put on a slider. So another way to offer a lot of options to players is to just have a ton of options and a ton of assets. So this is, of course, again, for the right type of game. Sims is all about this customization and this wealth of choice. So that only makes sense. But something really cool that they did as well is they went and picked apart their gameplay. So 2 years after Sims launched, they patched in gender options that weren't there at launch because they now let you set all of these things individually. So in Sims, you still do have the decision whether what basically the base of your sim is, but then you can still adjust a lot of other things. So for example, in the screenshot, you see that you can adjust the physical frame and the clothing preference separately from each other, but also very specific to Sims. You can decide whether your sim can become pregnant, can get other people pregnant, or neither, and also whether the sim can use the toilet standing or not, and not really making one choice and then being like, okay, you picked male, therefore you get this set of things, going back to not having these buckets, but these individual elements. And I believe actually they have added more choices since I took the screenshot. And what's also to consider is having things that tell you about gender in the form of clothes and scars and accessories. So these can even be trans-specific. So last year, Sims brought out this pack that included top surgery scars that trans men might have, shapewear for a more feminine figure through clothes, and in reverse, I suppose, a binder that allows you to flatten your chest and is really popular in the trans community. But of course, everyone expresses themselves through fashion in some sense, so you don't even need to think of this as being trans-specific when it comes to the wealth of options that Sims has. But it's very cool when you do think of that. And this is also the time to remind you that this goes way beyond gender, offering a lot of different body sizes and different skin tones and visible disabilities is also very important, because it's a little bit pointless when someone can get different gender options that would make them super happy, and then they can't actually get a shade dark enough for their skin to play as a Black character that represents them. Then it's kind of moot to have all of these other options. But that is also its own talk onto itself. But I do believe it's really important to not only be thinking about gender. So I wanted to put this here. There's also a few pitfalls that I want to warn you of that you can avoid. So one of these is make sure that you use fitting and informative descriptions for your options. That already goes a super long way. Because why call something a gender option when what it really does is set the pronouns and nothing else? Then you can just go ahead and call it pronouns. So, for example, Baldur's Gate does this really well a lot of points. So they have a label for body type, they have a label for voice, and then the voices are called voice 1, 2, and I think a few more. But the identity setting, which has male, female, and then non-binary / other, as far as I can tell, actually sets your pronouns. So it is much better advised to then call it that. So for example, in Arcade Spirit, that is pretty much how they did it. They don't ask your gender because that's irrelevant. They let you set all of these different things independently from each other. And in a similar vein, there can be a lot of frustration in your player base if you start linking choices. Because, for example, a voice and a pronoun are two different pairs of shoes. And in Cyberpunk 2077, which is the lower screenshot, when you select the masculine voice, for example, it gives you this little text that's like other characters will refer to V with male pronouns, for example, he, him. It would be a lot better if that were its own option. And it can get even more annoying when you obscure a choice that players are making, but don't realize that they're making it. For example, if you set the voice, it really should only set the voice and not the pronouns as well, which is unfortunately what Immortals Phoenix Rising does. The dev team is aware of this, and I know everyone tried really hard, and they've already done really cool things with their character creator as well to try and give people freedom. But this is like the last little bit where they stumbled, which is when you pick a voice, which are labeled voice 1 and voice 2, you get given either she, her when you pick up the higher voice, or he, him if you pick the lower pitched voice. And you're not told about this in advance. It just happens after you've started the game, which is really frustrating. And Cyberpunk, as much as I want to give them at least props for telling players, also stumbles over this because the voice is one of the things that influences which characters you can romance, which is not communicated to players ahead of time. So it kind of negates this player choice by having unintended consequences that players thought that they were not accidentally walking into. So to summarize, some useful questions to ask yourself. What assumptions are you making that we can turn over to players to choose instead? Is there a way to make players' choices more granular? How can we offer in-betweens? Can we multiply player choices, sorry, without multiplying the workload as well? Because with more variety, every player has a chance to find their niche in your game. Which brings us to the last question in this framework, the lens of how can players express themselves in play? So this is a really fun one that's going to yield some very different examples and is probably going to be the place where your games are going to be the most unique. Sorry, before I need to set up that, I was kind of hammering home the point earlier about when you pick gender signifiers, you're not actually picking a gender because it's better to treat these things separate from each other. But sometimes you maybe actually do want to make a statement about identity. This can create really meaningful interactions between the NPCs and the theme and the player. So, for example, in Dragon Age Inquisition, you have Krem, who is a trans man. And this was a really cool addition at the time. This was, I believe, one of the first, if not the first, instances of respectful representation in a AAA game. So super landmark. But when you talk to Krem, you can find out all sorts of things about his trans identity and his background and his history, and you can ask him all sorts of questions. So like, oh, how do you do this? And interesting. And but wouldn't it be really cool if when talking to Krem, instead of just assuming the role of the curious cisgender person who's like, oh, I really wonder how this trans stuff works, You can instead also go like, oh, hey, buddy, me too, and then bond over both being trans. And this is a rare chance that you have to explore what gender actually is if you want to write this into your game. Another really cool example is Queen at Arms, which is a visual novel that doesn't really offer very much character customization because the main character is a set character that you're playing as with a backstory and their own everything. But as per visual novel tradition, you can choose a few things, both over the course of the story in terms of plot, but also about your own character. So the story of the game is that the protagonist was essentially born as a girl, but then the nation needed a male heir and was then subsequently raised as a boy. And there's a point in the game where you can voice your opinion about how you feel about that. And you can have the main character say, no, I've actually always been a woman and I've just lived as a boy for safety. Or you can be like, yes, this was kind of a thing that happened by chance, but it turns out that I'm really happy living as a man and I want to continue. So that is super unique to this particular game with this particular premise, but also very cool. Another way you might not think of that allows players to express and play around with things is having fun with custom nicknames. This isn't necessarily about gender, but it can definitely be used as an avenue for expression and identity. So in Animal Crossing New Horizons, villagers will sometimes give you nicknames and sometimes will come up to you and be like, oh, I really want to have a cool nickname just for us too, because we're such good friends. And then you can tell them, sure, call me Maximum. And another way that goes a little bit more towards multiplayer and community is the idea of communicating with other players via symbols. This is a chance to be part of a community, to express your belonging to a community and statements of pride. For example, in Gears of War Online, they have a whole bunch of pride flags. This is maybe not something that we think of very much as expressing ourselves, but it absolutely is a part of that. Which brings us to the questions that you can ask yourself to figure out how you can build this for your own game. So how can players state their gender identity in your game? How can players communicate with other players and create a sense of community? Can players meaningfully interact with queer characters and themes in your game? And what's a fun way to express gender? And yeah, this is just an invitation for you to think of new ways for players to explore and express their identities in relation to gender. So, in conclusion, the 5 lenses that will help you design better gender options for your games are: what role does the player agenda have? How do you refer to the player? What is the basis of the player avatar? How can players accurately represent themselves in your game? And how can players express themselves in play? I'll also give you a moment if you'd like to screenshot this. And then I want to leave you with a little bit of further reading and recommendations, because I think if there are any particular things that you've latched onto in this talk, there is way more out there and way cooler things being done. There is Aubrey Scott's talk, Genderfuck 2077. I just realized that accidentally the text is the same color as the background, but I hope that you can remember this fantastic title, Genderfuck 2077. It is free on the GDC vault, and she covers a lot of fundamentals and also 3D text solutions. And there's also a very thorough and great overview talk by Benjamin Williams. It's called Respectful Non-Binary Representation and Localization, where he covers a lot of best practices. He also covers some tips and tricks on localization and also talks a little bit about non-binary authored characters. And it is also free on the vault. And 2 really great resources when you want to have a directory of various games. There is Represent Me, and there is the LGBTQ Game Archive, which are both really great resources. And if you'd like to chat to me more, you can find me on LinkedIn under my name, Arden Osthof, and also on Blue Sky and Twitter at Arden Ost. And before we open up the Q&A, I want to say that especially in the last few years, these types of cool things to put into your games have attracted a really loud and unsavory crowd that as soon as you offer some kind of pronoun selection in your game, will come into your Steam forum and be like, oh my God, is this game woke? And they're very loud and they're very annoying. But please remember, it is worth it. There are so many people who really felt seen for the first time because they had the chance to create characters that are like them or really inspire them to try out something new and bring them a lot of joy. And I just think everyone deserves to have that chance. And I think also ultimately, absolutely everyone benefits from this. So don't forget, people are really delighted about these things. And with that, thank you so much for attending this talk, even though it is very, very warm. And yeah, thank you so much to